Nowadays in Formula One, many fans complain about how drivers who haven't achieved much in Junior Series are promoted to Formula One, either due to having acquired immense personal wealth or sponsors that provide extensive financial backing. Despite complaints about the presence of paid drivers, it's actually the case that paid drivers have been around since the early days of competitive racing, and more specifically, Formula One. It's well documented that many F1 drivers during the 1950s came from nobility. Prince Birabongsi Banudej of Siam, which is now Thailand, raced for 5 years between 1950 and 1954, achieving 8th place in the Drivers' Championship in 1950, also winning 2 non-championship races in 1951 and 1954 respectively. Although he came from riches, he clearly had a decent level of performance to match his royal status. Also prominent during the 1950s, Alfonso de Portago, the godson of Spanish King Alfonso XIII, entered 5 F1 races during 1956 and 57. He got 2 points finishes, including a second place during the 1956 British Grand Prix, becoming the first Spanish driver to get a podium in F1. To give an example of a higher quality driver, Wolfgang von Trips, runner-up in the 1961 Drivers' Championship, also came from a noble background. He achieved 2 race wins before being killed in the penultimate round of the season at Monza after a crash while leading the Drivers' Championship. In these examples of early Formula One paid drivers, they weren't paid drivers in the way we know them today. It was more that the perks that came from being royalty gave them opportunities to drive fast cars and compete in the top motorsport series more easily. As the sport progressed into the 1960s, cars became faster and more dangerous. Maybe this is a reason why there weren't any paid drivers of note, as most teams were financially secure and didn't want any random unqualified nutcase coming along and tainting the team's reputation by underperforming. Some may point to the performances of Canadian Alpine, widely regarded as the worst driver in F1 history. However, despite him being disqualified for driving too slowly during his home Grand Prix in 1969, having completed less than half the laps that the leaders had at that time, he wasn't a paid driver. As Formula One moved into the 1970s and 80s, the idea of paid drivers would completely change. The most notable paid driver of the 1970s is none other than 3-time world champion Niki Lauda. After his career stalled preceding a season in the World Sports Car Championship, Lauda took out a bank loan worth £30,000, which is over £500,000 in today's money, in order to compete in Formula 2 in 1971. After competing in 9 out of 11 rounds, he finished 10th in the drivers' standings. He also made his Grand Prix debut that year in his home race at the Oostenrijkring, retiring early on due to handling issues after qualifying second from last. After a disappointing dual campaign in F1 and F2 in 1972, which saw him get no meaningful results in Formula 1, he doubled down on his pay driver status by taking out another loan to drive for BRM in 1973. This time worth £100,000, more than £1.5 million in today's money. He was banking on the possibility that by the time he would need to pay off his debts, he would have already become a household name in Formula One. Luckily for Lauda, a stellar performance in the Monaco Grand Prix in 1973 saw him get the attention of Enzo Ferrari, who, following advice from Lauda's BRM teammate Clay Regazzoni, signed Lauda to Ferrari for 1974, meaning Lauda's loan debts were now cleared. Lauda would go on to win 2 drivers' titles with Ferrari, and after coming back from retirement in 1982, won the title with McLaren for a 3rd time in 1984. Lauda's story is an example of why paid drivers are not always bad drivers, and we shouldn't be too quick to judge them. However, the next notable paid driver would undo lots of Lauda's incredible work in the eyes of some, tainting the reputation of paid drivers in the late 70s and early 80s. Hector Rybak joined the flailing Hesketh team in 1977 following a season in IMSA Formula Atlantic the year prior, where he finished 9th in the drivers' standings, behind future racing legends such as Gilles Villeneuve and Bobby Rahal. He also finished behind 3 drivers in the standings who are so obscure that they don't have Wikipedia pages. Rybak entered 6 races for Hesketh in his debut season, only qualifying for 1, in which he retired. Unable to secure a drive for 1978 due to poor performance, instead of calling it a day, Hector decided to create his own team, aptly named Rybak. He bought a Lotus 78 chassis, which won races in the hands of Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson, and Rybak would run his chassis as a privateer. Out of 16 races that season, in a race-winning and championship-winning chassis, Rybak scored a grand total of 1 point, following a 6th place in Hockenheim. He failed to qualify for 7 races and retired from 5. In the remaining 4, he got a 12th, an 11th, a 10th, and the aforementioned 6th place. In 1979, he stuck with his own team, upgrading to the newer, more competitive Lotus 79 for most of the season. It wouldn't be until the 8th race in France that he finished a race, in 12th, having had 5 retirements and a DNQ before it. Following a 9th place, then a retirement, another DNQ, and a 7th place, Rybak then commissioned Penske to build a car for his own team. They obliged, and the Rybak HR100 arrived at the Italian Grand Prix, becoming the first non-customer car the team had used. Ironically, the car bore a striking resemblance to the Lotus 79 and that year's Williams car, but this design strategy didn't bear any fruit, as Hector failed to qualify for 2 of the last 3 races of the season, retiring in the other. Having competed in 2 seasons with the best or second best car of its respective season, Rybak had only scored 1 point. For 1980, he signed for Brabham as teammate to the up-and-coming Nelson Piquet. He didn't race until the 8th round at Brands Hatch, but he achieved 7th at Brands and later a 6th place at Canada. In 1981, his second year with Brabham, it would be his most competitive year. He would achieve 3 4th place finishes at Imola, Hockenheim and Zandvoort, along with a 5th at Silverstone. The 11 points from these races would get him 10th in the drivers' standings, although this total was less than a quarter of his teammate and champion Nelson Piquet. Rybak's poor performance meant that Brabham couldn't fight for constructors' glory, as the Williams duo of Carlos Reutemann and Alan Jones were far more prolific than the one-sided attempts from the Piquet-Rybak pairing. This probably contributed to Brabham's decision not to retain Rybak for 1982, with Rybak racing in IndyCar instead, winning 1 race at Road America before retiring from racing. Honestly, Rybak was not the worst driver, but he really wasn't worthy of the cars he drove. He drove 4 race-winning and championship potential cars, despite clearly not having the ability to push the cars to their limits. James Hunt once mocked during commentary that Rybak is not a world-class driver, and that him being ahead of better drivers in slower cars was making a mockery of Grand Prix racing. Ouch. As the 80s progressed, another paid driver came to fruition, except he is the first driver on this list whose money didn't come from his personal wealth. Andrea de Cesaris was the village bicycle of Formula 1 in the 80s and early 90s, racing for 10 different teams in 15 seasons, racking up 208 race starts in the process. De Cesaris' money came from a lucrative personal sponsorship in the form of Marlboro cigarettes. After winning multiple karting titles, he graduated to Formula 3 in 1978, then in 1979 he stayed in that series, finishing runner-up and getting promoted to Formula 2 for 1980. He would compete in 11 races before being called up by Alfa Romeo to replace the Monza Gorilla Vittorio Brambilla for 2 races, although he retired from both. Races, Ron Dennis, the team principal of McLaren, clearly saw something in De Cesaris as he signed him up for 1981. However, following a season where he got outscored 27-1 by his teammate race winner John Watson, Ron Dennis was incensed and did not re-sign De Cesaris for 1982, and also Dennis never signed another Italian driver during his tenure at McLaren. De Cesaris then signed again for Alfa Romeo, and at the 3rd race in Long Beach, he got pole position, although he would retire from the race after spinning off. However, he would get another chance at Monaco, as during the last 5 laps, several leaders faltered, either due to crashing or a mechanical problem. Andrea would unfortunately also have a mechanical issue, running out of fuel on the last lap before he had a chance to take the lead, which he would have done had he continued. Nonetheless, he claimed 3rd position and stood on the podium for the first time despite having not crossed the finish line. He got 1 more point from a 6th place in Canada that season, but the season was marred with DNFs, something De Cesaris was getting a reputation for. 1983 saw him stay with Alfa Romeo and claim 8th in the drivers' standings, despite him only finishing 5 of the 15 races. He scored points 3 times, including 2 second-place finishes at Hockenheim and Kyalami, respectively. For 1984, he switched to Ligier, picking up all his team's points, although he did also retire 9 times. He stayed with Ligier for 85, also getting 3 points, but this time his teammates scored 20 points altogether. Also, following a quadruple barrel roll crash at Austria, the team fired him, preceding the next round at Zandvoort. For 1986, he moved to Minardi, which was a disaster. He retired from all but one race, where he finished 8th in Mexico. It was around this time that he gained an unenviable record that he still holds to this day. De Cesaris did not finish 22 consecutive races from 1986 to 1988. Even when he got a podium in Spa 1987 for Brabham, he still ran out of fuel, but maintained third as everyone else behind him was lapped. He would only achieve one further podium, a third place for Dallara in Canada, but he retired in 1994 following a career with the most races without a DNF with 208, the joint most DNFs with 148, the most consecutive DNFs from the start of a season with 16, and the most DNFs in one season with 14, which he achieved in both 1986 and 1987. De Cesaris was undoubtedly rapid, but also too error-prone for his career to really get off the ground. He always shifted between teams who were hoping to get the crashing out of him while collecting Marlboro's money, but he just wasn't good enough. As we moved into the 90s, a whole new type of pay driver started coming in. Towards the end of the 80s and the start of the 1990s, a whole barrage of teams on a shoestring budget joined Formula One, usually after stints in the lower formulae. This meant that, due to a lack of money, they often had to hire drivers who brought significant funds, regardless of their driving prowess. One of the first examples during the 90s was a German driver called Michael Schumacher. He was a Mercedes Works driver in the World Sports Car Championship, but when a seat opened at the Jordan Grand Prix team for the Belgian Grand Prix following the imprisonment of Bertrand Gachot, the team's first driver, Mercedes paid $150,000 to put Schumacher in the seat for the rest of the season. Following a stellar debut which saw him qualify 7th before retiring on the first lap due to clutch issues, Schumacher then went on to have a fairly unremarkable career outside of Formula One, practically retired until he had a skiing accident which has left him permanently disabled ever since. The next notable pay driver was Giovanna Amati. Amati is the last female driver to start a Formula One race. She tested for Benetton in 1991 amid rumours she was having an affair with team principal Flavio Briatore. She signed up backmarker team Brabham in 1992, but following HAT Plus performances, where she was at quickest 9 seconds off the pole sitter, she was dropped by the team to make way for Williams test driver and future world champion Damon Hill. Towards the end of the 1994 season, Jean-Denis Delatraz entered the season finale at Adelaide for Team Larousse. He was hopelessly off the pace, having not raced single-seaters in over 3 years, even though he wasn't particularly competitive in any series before racing in F1. Question marks were thrown over John's expertise, which were then validated when he was lapped 10 times before retiring on lap 57. His next race was at Estoril in 1995, driving for the Pacific Lotus team. He was lapping the circuit 12 seconds slower than leader David Coulthard before retiring due to cramp on lap 14. In his third and final race at the Nürburgring, he qualified 9 seconds off the pole time before finishing 7 laps down. During the race, it was believed he had been weaving around the track as leaders approached, causing Murray Walker to utter the iconic line, "What is Delatraz doing?" Although this wasn't Delatraz, it was his teammate Andrea Montermini. After Delatraz's terrible performances, the governing body, the FIA, introduced the 107% rule, colloquially known as the Delatraz rule, which was put in to stop hopelessly uncompetitive teams and drivers from qualifying for a race. Tarso Marquez was the next pay driver, not competing in any full season, instead deputising whenever Minardi needed a driver. Also something to note, both Delatraz and Marquez had defaulted on their payments to their respective teams, so they were effectively pay drivers without the pay. Tarso was also Fernando Alonso's teammate in 2001, actually beating the young driver in the driver's standings at the end of the season. His successor at Minardi would be the first pay driver in the modern sense of the word. Alex Young came to Formula One in late 2001 with major backing from the Malaysian government. Unlike his predecessor Marquez, Young actually paid the Minardi team, but was hopelessly slow, having to be replaced by Anthony Davidson midway through the 2002 season while he went on an intensive training course to improve his driving. This didn't work, however, and Young was dropped before the 2003 season rolled around. In late 2003, Hungarian Zsolt Baumgartner debuted for the Jordan team following an injury for Ralph Furman. He would then move to another backmarker team, Minardi, for 2004, partnering Gianmaria Bruni. Zsolt showed decent progress throughout the season and scored a point for getting 8th in the US Grand Prix following many drivers dropping out of the race due to accidents or black flags. The mid-2000s had plenty of pay drivers. In 2005, Jordan fielded an all-rookie, all-pay driver lineup of Thiago Monteiro and Narain Kalfakayan, with Minardi fielding 3 pay drivers in the form of Christian Albers, Patrick Friesacker and Robert Dornbos. During the unusual 2005 US Grand Prix, the Jordan duo and the 2 Minardis of Albers and Friesacker would battle it out for a chance at their first podium. And if they all finished the race, they would all get the first points. Monteiro ended up with the 3rd place trophy, the only person celebrating in Indianapolis that day. His teammate Kalfakayan came home 4th, followed by Albers, then Friesacker. Furthermore, during Friday practice during the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend, Israeli driver Chanok Nissany drove the Minardi after paying the team. He set a time 13 seconds off the lead pace, then late in the session spun off and his car was craned off with him still in it, as he didn't know how to get the steering wheel off and therefore get out of the car. Midway through 2006, Japanese driver Sakon Yamamoto joined Super Aguri, helping the team reassume their all-Japanese driver lineup that they wanted. Yamamoto and the previously mentioned Kalfakayan would do sporadic stints in F1 until the early 2010s, both with HRT. The others wouldn't be in F1 post-2006 though. Williams signed Kazuki Nakajima in order to secure Toyota engines, and his performances resembled those of a pay driver. The team kept him for 2 and a bit seasons before letting him go before the 2010 season. The influx of new teams in 2010 only saw the debut of one new pay driver, Karun Chandok. He did 10 races before being dropped in favour of the aforementioned Yamamoto and then Christine Klein. 2011 saw 2 new drivers come along with backing. Pastor Maldonado joined with sponsorship money from PDVSA Oil, a Venezuelan government-owned company. Sergio Perez joined with money coming from Carlos Slim, the richest man in Mexico. Maldonado lasted 5 seasons, often driving fast but recklessly. He won a race and got pole position once, but he had so much more potential if he didn't fuck it into the barriers every 5 seconds. Perez, on the other hand, had a shaky first season, but managed to prove himself in midfield machinery, following a disappointing move to McLaren in 2013. Perez is now at Red Bull, following a classy 2020 season, which saw him get his first win and 4th in the Drivers' Championship in a Racing Point, which was the 3rd fastest car that year. His compatriot, who joined F1 at a similar time, Esteban Gutierrez, didn't fare as well. He was outscored 51-6 by teammate Hulkenberg in 2013 and fared no better in 2014, being dropped following mediocre pace, apart from his one good race in Suzuka 2013 where he got all of his 6 points. Max Chilton also only lasted 2 seasons, with his only notable stat being his record for the most consecutive race finishes from a Grand Prix debut, with 26, which was then beaten by Esteban Ocon. In 2014, Marcus Ericsson signed for Caterham and drove pretty badly, including at Spa, where brand new teammate Andre Lotterer, who hadn't driven the car before that weekend, outqualified him by a second. For the last race in Abu Dhabi, Will Stevens paid £500,000 to debut for the Caterham team ahead of his full-time debut in the following season for Manor. He qualified and finished last. For the 2015 season, Ericsson moved to Sauber and Stevens went to Manor as predicted. Stevens did all he could in crap machinery, however, Ericsson massively underperformed, with teammate Felipe Nasr scoring 3 times Marcus's points. 2016 saw the arrival of Jolyon Palmer and Rio Haryanto. Haryanto's money dried up and was dropped after the summer break, whereas Palmer ended the season with 1 point, compared to 7 for his teammate Kevin Magnussen. Furthermore, fans were outraged that Felipe Nasr was dropped for the 2017 season, despite outclassing Ericsson throughout the 2016 season, scoring Sauber's only points when Marcus didn't even come close to doing so. 2017 saw Lance Stroll become the second youngest driver in F1 history when he joined Williams. He was inconsistent but showed flashes of brilliance at Baku and Monza. Ericsson, still at Sauber, was outperformed by new teammate Pascal Wehrlein. Pascal scored 5 points, whereas Marcus scored 0. 2018 saw the arrival and subsequent departure of Sergei Sirotkin. He was okay, but not spectacular, scoring a point for finishing 10th at Monza. Meanwhile, Ericsson underperformed again, but this time he was finally dropped at the end of the season. He only scored a quarter of his teammate Charles Leclerc's points. Lance's 2018 wasn't amazing, although he did outperform rookie teammate Sirotkin. Fans also became angry when Stroll's dad purchased the Force India team, meaning Lance now had a guaranteed seat in F1 for as long as his dad owned the team. When Robert Kubica returned to F1 in 2019 after 8 seasons away, it was money from the Polish oil company Orlen that guaranteed his seat, and he was mostly outclassed by teammate George Russell, apart from at race starts and in wet weather, getting the team's sole constructors' point in a wet German race. Lance still showed weaknesses in areas like qualifying, but overall he performed decently. For 2020, he will be joined on the grid by his compatriot Nicholas Latifi. Nicholas was slower than his teammate George, especially in qualifying. However, he showed decent-ish potential with an overtake in Silverstone and not binning it in Imola like George did. Stroll also showed inconsistent potential. He got his first pole position, then led half that race in Turkey, but ended up 11th in the driver's standings when Sergio was 4th. 2021 would see the mighty Maz come in as a pay driver, dashing the Russian flag all over an American team's livery, then proceeded to win every race by 40 seconds before dipping out when his dad's mate flew some toy planes over an old friend's land. What a legend. In 2022, Stroll and Latifi would overall taint the reputation of pay drivers. Maybe this judgment is unfair on Lance, as he wasn't particularly awful, just his usual inconsistent, and not very spatially aware. However, his Canadian friend Nicholas really struggled with pace, clearly way out of his depth. However, Zhou Guanyu shocked many who thought he'd just be another bad pay driver. Bringing in 30 million monies from China, he performed well. Despite the results looking bad on paper, he was relatively competitive most of the season, only just behind Valtteri, his teammate, learning lots. As we move into 2023, Lance and Zhou are the only 2 pay drivers on the grid. Will Lance finally drop his inconsistency, and will Zhou build on his promising first season? Anyway, that's the end of the video on the history of pay drivers in F1. Leave your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think that pay drivers have got better or worse over the years? And do you think there should even be an F1 in the first place? Do you think F1 should be a meritocracy in a way? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see you all later. Bye!